evening. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. Happy New Year's Eve. No, it's not actually New Year's Eve. We're taping this a little earlier than New Year's Eve, but this show is scheduled for broadcast New Year's Eve day. With us today, we have Luther Weeks with the ConnecticutVotersCount.org. He's also a member of the Connecticut Citizens Election Audit Coalition. When Luther was on before, we talked about the upcoming audits. Now we're in the middle of those audits. Luther's seeing some of the results coming in, and I was there for the audit in Wilton, Connecticut. And we're going to talk a little bit about observations about the audits, and time permitting, we're also going to talk about instant runoff voting. Luther, share with us some of the structural issues of the audit so far. How have they been going?
Okay, well, just to put a little background in, after our election, Secretary of State picks 10% of the voting districts in the state to be audited, and then the towns that have those districts within them then have to count the votes in those particular districts. And it's over about a 2-week period, and as this is being taped, we're about 2/3 of the way through those audits. We haven't got all the data in yet. I'd say that we're doing a little better than we've done in the past. Not, and I say it's the election officials are doing a little bit better. Yeah. But it's sort of like, a big city school system that, 10% of the students are graduating from high school, and it used to be 8. So there's some good news, but let's not completely celebrate yet.
So we're heading in the right direction on proving to all of us that that Connecticut elections are being run accurately.
Yep, and we're not there yet. As I've said before, we don't know of any problems. The problem is that we don't count as accurately as we should, and therefore, and then when there are discrepancies found, those are all written out as hand counting errors. The problem is if there really ever was a problem, a machine that didn't count right, then if we dismiss everything as a human error in counting, we would never attribute anything to a machine error.
So actually what we're doing is we're recounting, we're verifying by hand count in those districts what the machine has counted, and we're verifying that the machine counted accurately or did not count accurately. I've been doing this a little while. I've been through 3 or 4 of these, and the only thing that I've found in any of the counts I've been to was in Fairfield for the Democratic presidential primary last year. And one of the machines, well, actually our count was off for one of the 2 candidates. Well, one of the candidates was off by 1. The registrars of voters went back in, physically went back into the actual machines where the votes were counted, reached up and into the machines, and lo and behold, found one piece of paper, one vote that had been counted by the machine, but had not come all the way through, and therefore we did not have that physical count until we found that extra piece of paper. Now, you mentioned before we came on about the some of the ways that our votes, that are the actual physical paper ballots are set out that you find troublesome. Would you like to go into detail about that?
Sure. I just mentioned though first that you've had a very good experience with the audits. You've been in several with us, and only find one vote discrepancy. Last year we had discrepancies of 366 votes, 20% of the votes in many of our towns, and probably more than half, maybe 2/3 of the towns had errors much higher than your 1 error or 2 errors, and maybe 20% of them had very, very big errors. So your experience is not typical. This year we're seeing less of that. We're seeing a much smaller level of errors. But let me go into the...
What do you attribute that to, these, if you have a discrepancy of maybe 300 votes? Now this is for apparently a number of machines within a district?
This is typically one machine.
One machine showing an error of into the 300s?
Yep. And well, no, it wasn't the machine showing an error. It was probably the people didn't count well, and they just took their first take at it and put the numbers together, put them on a piece of paper, and reported it to the Secretary of State. And the same thing when then there's an error of 5 or 6 or 3. A lot of times people accept that first count, and I see that their counting methods could be a lot more accurate.
How
Yeah.
are they making that kind of counting error?
Counting ballots can be tedious. You set 100 ballots in front of you, and you start counting them, and you may be 70 years old. You may not hear the other person that's calling the votes as you fill them in. It would be very hard for me to count 100 votes accurately. You and I to do that without somebody watching over our shoulder to check that I don't make a single error. Because these are count sometimes 1,000 votes.
I was going to say, because I saw tables where a team of 4 people, 2 reviewing the ballot and 2 listening and making a hash mark on one candidate or another or a series of candidates. And while they're doing that, there's not much in the way of distractions, but between the 4 people and 2 people doing one task and 2 people doing the other task, you could certainly, making piles of 25, you could certainly have mistakes, but aren't they supposed to, if they find a mistake, aren't they supposed to go back and physically recount one table? Yes, they have 3 tables that are counting a race, 3 groups of people. And as you recount the races, the 3 tables combined, let's say they're off by a total of 10. Aren't they all supposed to go back, not knowing where the mistakes arrived out of? Aren't they all supposed to go back and do a complete recount if they find a discrepancy?
Sure.
And what happens?
But they don't all do that.
They don't.
And you saw 4 people on a team counting, which is what I highly recommend. I very seldom see that. What I see is 2 people on a team counting. So I was in an audit today where we had 5 teams of 2 people each counting. The registrars instructed them to check each other's work, which they did not do. And in fact, I've been to 4 audits this cycle so far, and every one of them used 2-person teams. And so, and typically, it's rather strange. Whether there's 3 teams or 4 teams or 5 teams, I find that there's one team that looks to me like they're not doing, they're not up to speed. And I think a lot of times that's why the count is off. But I think it's very hard, even for if there are 2 of us or 2 people to do it. You really need that team of 4. And if you find a discrepancy, you should count again to make sure you counted right. And maybe you'll find you'll find a different number. If you find the same number, then maybe you counted right, and maybe there really is a problem
with the machine. Now, I was in Wilton. And one thing that I happened to notice that caught my eye was, in Wilton you had a majority party and a minority party. And I won't say which one it was, and it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. Because this will be the case, and I'm presuming every town in Connecticut has one party that has some dominance and one party is not as dominant as the other party. The minority party only ran a candidate, one candidate, in one race out of, I'm going to say 8 races. One candidate. Other than that, all the other 7 races, there was only a majority party candidate. 0 competition. And thankfully, you had a fair turnout in Wilton because they had an issue which caught people's eye, and that was whether Wilton should remain a dry town or not. And the voters came out and decided, I believe they decided, that Wilton will now be able to serve alcohol in restaurants and will be able to have a liquor store, which it did not until now. It was the only dry town in Connecticut. But on the ballot, in the recounts, I noticed that, for instance, the first selectman, which only had one candidate from one party, 30% of the people that came out to vote, that took the time to come out and cast their ballots on that day, did not cast a ballot for the first selectman candidate. They just ignored writing in that. I mean, it was only another second to make a little black dot on that ballot and affirm their decision that, well, there's only one candidate, we're stuck with them, we might as well vote for them. A full 30% of the voters chose to not mark their ballot for first selectman. Even more amazing, there was Board of Education, 2 candidates from the majority party, 0 candidates from the minority party. 40% of the people that took the time to come out and vote decided to not mark in the names of the 2 majority party candidates. Didn't take the 2 seconds to mark them in. Additionally to that 40%, there was about another 5% of the people that came out and filled in one of the candidates but did not fill in the other candidate. So that appears to be a lot of dissatisfaction with those 2 particular candidates, 40–45% dissatisfaction with at least one of those 2 candidates. And you could comment on this, but it seems to me that if the minority party had run anybody, didn't even have to campaign, just put a name on the 2 names on the ballot, they might have gotten 40% of the vote. Does that make sense to you?
It makes some sense. Another, you know, and looking at a lot of ballots, though, even in towns that are relatively competitive, a lot of voters might come in and just vote for one person. So I see a lot of that.
Okay.
And maybe that's that town politics isn't engaging enough that they know more than one person on the ballot, and you know that's a commentary too.
So they've decided that if they don't know the candidate for any given office, rather than actually voting for that candidate, they're just going to not vote on that particular office. That makes sense.
That's an idea. Sense. I mean, I can't tell the motivation of a particular person.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of ballots where
voter
people
intent
just
is a hard thing to judge.
Yeah, but I'd actually commend the voters that did come out in Wilton to vote. Probably most of them thinking that their vote really doesn't matter because of so little competition. Even if you're voting for the majority party, a lot of people must assume, gee, why bother?
Yeah. Why take the time to fill in a little dot?
Why go to the polls? Why should I bother? Because I know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm sure that dampens a lot of enthusiasm in any town where you don't have a full slate of candidates, at least 2 full slates of candidates. Now, speaking of voter intent, there are obviously some ballots that you find where rather than filling in the dot, a voter will circle around the perimeter of the dot, or they'll make a check mark, or they'll do some other way of marking the ballot. How much of that dot needs to be filled in for the machine to read the vote?
Technically, if the machine is tuned properly, I believe it's supposed to be 15% of that dot. And I suspect that most machines will read a much less than 15%. So that, you know, if someone does a check or an X and they hit the dot, it's probably counted by the machine.
It'll count it, okay. Because we had, I think, there were only maybe 4 votes in Wilton that were questionable, and of those 4 votes, in recounting the votes, we found that one of them had actually been counted, and the other 3 were not. The other 3 just didn't quite have enough marking. So that didn't have, when you're talking about literally into thousands of votes, 3 or 4 votes where people don't do it right doesn't make much of a difference. So the machines are doing their job in terms of reading the intent of the voter, rather than just those that are perfect at filling in dots.
Properly tuned and properly programmed machine, which we usually have, will do that. Kind of votes it would miss, though, is if you circle the candidate name, or if you circle in a candidate and then you cross it off and then you circle in another one, it won't catch that. But that's why we have a mandatory recanvass on a close vote.
Yeah.
And that's designed to catch those cases where the machine couldn't have possibly read the voter's intent.
Yeah. How many votes were there in Connecticut that the votes were close enough to demand a recount?
Well, in this election, and it's a municipal election, this always happens to us, where you have these vote for 8 races. I think in Greenwich they have a vote for 20 out of 22 or something like that. When you have a lot of candidates in a race, they're much closer together. They tend to be, you know, there's a lot more opportunities for 2 candidates to be less than 0.5% difference in votes, especially a vote for 8 out of 16, let's say.
Yes.
If you think of a dartboard, if you show 16 darts, what are the odds that 2 darts will be very near the center of that dartboard? And it's those 2 in center, the one that just barely lost and the one that just barely won. So we had I think it was about 180 or something, or maybe 150 districts out of around 590 in Connecticut this time that had recounts, or we call them recanvasses in Connecticut, and they're not really as good as a recount, but we had quite a few. In a municipal election, we tend to have those.
Yep.
The interesting thing and challenging thing is if we ever have a very tight race in a statewide race where we have to do a recanvass in the entire state. So next year, let's say we're going to have some very contentious primaries, probably 3 or 4 of them.
Yes.
And with 5 candidates in the race, there's only one going to win, but there's a good chance that it might be close in one of those. We'd have a statewide recount, a recanvass, and we don't have a lot of time between the primary and the general election to determine the winner.
Right, and the winner wants to know, the winner and the losers all want to know immediately, if not sooner, who's going to be the candidate and who's going forward to the general election, and who's going to have, because of, by dint of being the winning candidate of the 4, like maybe 6 on the Democratic side for governor, for instance, they want to know who's going to have the money to spend so they can plan out spending that money.
Sure, and election officials who have to do the recanvass and any fallout from that, they've got to figure out what's going to be on their ballots. So the ballots can get printed, the machines can get programmed, they can get ready for the election, get ballots out to our military.
Oh, that's right. I thought about that. The overseas ballots, because those have to be in within a certain time frame after the election. They've got to be certified, done properly, and be counted. Certainly in a close election, they could certainly affect the outcome of an election. Talk about the chain of custody, because that was another issue that was important to the initiative of recanvassing and auditing votes.
Sure. Count the votes and see if the machine worked right. Yeah.
We want to know. To count the votes is one thing, but we want to make sure that somebody didn't throw another handful of votes in, like seems to have happened in Iraq. What does Connecticut do to make sure that every vote is counted and no votes that are not cast are not counted?
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's very little protection after Election Day. So on Election Day, I think we got a pretty safe system. You vote on a piece of paper and it goes into a machine, and it's kind of publicly counted. So to change that machine's result, you'd have to have the memory card program wrong or machine design wrong, and you got this piece of paper to match up with that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, though, before we do the audits, we don't have a great chain of custody in Connecticut. In other states, the ballots are held in vaults, typically.
Okay.
You have things like video surveillance of the vaults, guards guarding these vaults, and they run elections by county, so they have a little more volume and a little more economies of scale.
Yeah, so they've got larger numbers of votes and larger numbers of machines in one location, so you maybe can afford to have video surveillance or round-the-clock human surveillance outside a door.
Right. Right. And whereas in Connecticut and all of New England, you have a town-by-town election management. So we have a case where instead of all of what we talked about, we have seals on the ballot cases, but those seals can be compromised in a median of 43 seconds. So they're useful, but you need to protect the ballot bag that's sealed from access. And the idea is you should really have 2 people of opposing party, of opposing interest to go to the ballots.
We did.
So
in the case of Wilton,
you should actually have those stored in a place where it has a double key lock. One key belongs to one registrar, one the other registrar, or maybe the registrars have a key and the town clerk has a key, and somebody recording access and who gets in there. That's not what happens in most of the Connecticut towns. They're held in a place where either registrar has a key to the place where the ballots are.
So one registrar could compromise ballots without the other registrar knowing.
Right. And in some towns, any official on the registrar's staff has access to that key. In other towns, in some of them, the town clerk has access, anyone their staff. In some towns, even the janitor has access to the room where the ballots are stored. In my town, they're stored in an abandoned school that's, a 100-foot walk from town hall, in what you would think of as an ordinary classroom with, a lock of an ordinary classroom door.
Just a regular hand lock on a door?
Yeah. And, people depend on officials to log their access, when they go into the room.
So it's counting on people being honest about going in and not going in.
Right. And I noticed in the room there's plenty of instances where single people are going into the room where they've logged in. And I don't want to single out my town because that's not completely atypical.
Yeah.
Maybe the lock on the door is a little weaker than some other ones, but there's certainly equivalent in many. And we just had a big problem in Haddam. Maybe you read about that. Haddam, Connecticut.
No, I did not.
They had an election that was very close, and a member of one party won by one vote, and so they had the recanvass, and they finished the recanvass. And it turned out that the member of another party had won by one vote.
So a discrepancy of 2 votes.
2 votes. Well, it changed by 2 votes, which is not atypical in a recanvass. That's why we do it, because of that voter's intent issue.
Yeah, they did that in Ridgefield, actually, and one candidate at the end was ahead by 2 votes.
Right.
And in the recanvass, that gap was narrowed to 0.
Right.
So now, actually, today, I believe, the revote is. They have to do a complete
because
revote
it was a tie
for that Board of Education seat.
Yeah. But what happened in Haddam is the next day, one of the registrars was looking at the tally sheets and noticed, I believe they saw a 2 was added up, but they saw 3 hash marks. So the obvious thing is, did somebody misadd all this stuff up?
Yeah.
And so the natural thing to go from there is this the right count or not? We want to look at those ballots again.
So perhaps there should be a re-audit
or just get
canvas.
out just these hand-counted ones that they knew, because there was only a few ballots involved.
Yeah.
But instead of waiting for the other registrar to come back from a couple days vacation, she and one of her assistants, who happened to be from the same party, went in, got the ballots, looked at them, and saw yes, the 3 hash marks were correct, and actually it's a tie election. The problem is that then everyone realizes that that's not what you want to have happen. There's always this doubt because members of one party went in and did that. And it goes both ways. An election official shouldn't want to do that.
Right.
Because no matter how honest they are, now that official and probably the person went in with her, there's always this lingering doubt that they did something that changed that result. So they shouldn't want to have that burden.
That is a tremendous burden to have on your shoulders.
Right.
It's a lose-lose situation for that individual.
Yeah, and I thought that was a great educational moment for Connecticut because I'm glad that Hartford Courant had an editorial about that, and there was lots of write-up in it. But it's a recognition of how important the chain of custody is. But for me, it's educational because it's to say, look, we're doing audits, and we got to have that same kind of chain of custody for audits, which we don't. Yeah. And in fact, because those registrars made that mistake before the 14 days after the election, the law says they shouldn't do that, I believe. So they may have actually violated the law. If they waited to day 15, the law doesn't say the ballots have to be sealed like that, only procedures and regulations. And in Connecticut, procedures and regulations are not enforceable. And so our audits start on day 15, right after you don't have a legal protection of the chain of custody.
Another important thing that you mentioned before we came on the show was about the actual layout of the physical layout of the ballot, paper ballot, and how it basically, as I understood it, the ballot basically duplicates the line item that used to be physically on the machine, where people would actually turn down a lever in order to vote for a particular candidate. And the paper basically looks just like that, with Party A, Party B, Party C, Party D, Party E. And of course the minor parties that sometimes will cross-endorse with one of the two major parties.
Right.
What's wrong with that, and how do we rectify it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, one of the things that's wrong with that is other states use what they call nonpartisan elections. It doesn't necessarily mean the people aren't. The people are still part of parties. You still vote for
Right.
Barack Obama or John McCain or whatever, and everybody knows what party they're in.
Sure.
But instead of randomly selecting the candidates and putting them on a party line, they will randomly select from all the candidates and put them in, let's say, a column
So there's a
on
cluster,
the ballot.
So there's a cluster of candidates to choose from,
Yeah.
and if you went into the voting booth not knowing which candidate was from which party, you would not know which candidate was from which party.
Yeah, I believe you could put the party name on there, but you still have to stare at it a little more. You don't
Right.
go in there and say, I'll grab this, all these across here, or I'll go up and down, or whatever.
So it requires a little more thinking than just
in my standpoint,
ding,
yeah.
ding, 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 ding.
Right.
Because that was one of the complaints against the old ballots, was that people had a tendency to come in and vote straight party line.
Right, and I've noticed a new effect on that. In this particular audit, I've been looking at the ballots in the towns I've been going to and talking to some of the officials while we're counting.
Yeah.
And, we randomly select, let's say if you're running for town council, we randomly select from the Republicans and they go on line 1, and we randomly select the Democrats and they go on line 2. How many votes you get depends not just on how popular you might be, but what candidate is above you and below you. Because mentally, somehow, when people vote for somebody in column number 1,
Yeah.
then they will be reluctant to vote for another person in column 1, even though they're mixing and matching parties. So we have cases where, why did this person come out with so many lower votes than anybody else? We thought they would do,
You mentioned
much better.
Something that you thought logically thinking, would do much better than another candidate, and in fact it turned out the opposite way.
Right. In another town I was in, one party, I think, had 4 candidates for a particular office.
Okay.
The other had 2.
We're wrapping up now.
Yep.
So give us some final thoughts on the audit, and where do we go from here?
Well, I think we need to have enforceable procedures and regulations. Our audit's actually inefficient, so we can make a stronger audit and do it more
Okay.
effectively.
This has been Progressive Soup. I'm David Stevenson. Luther Weeks, thanks. Have a good evening.